What if the mathematical objective you use to train your multimodal models is actually actively fighting against you?
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought for anyone spending thousands of GPU hours on these models.
Right. Because you spend all this compute trying to align text and images in a shared embedding space. And you just assume that stochastic gradient descent is, sculpting this beautiful, perfectly isotropic hypersphere where all your data is uniformly distributed.
Which is what we're taught it should do.
Exactly. But the geometry of your neural network might actually be quietly holding your modalities at arm's length. So today, for those of you architecting machine learning pipelines, we are dismantling that isotropic assumption entirely.
It is definitely time to rethink what's happening under the hood.
We are doing a deep dive into a NeurIPS 2022 paper from researchers at Stanford and Columbia. It's called Mind the Gap: Understanding the Modality Gap in Multi-modal Contrastive Representation Learning.
Yeah, and the authors essentially put models like OpenAI, CLIP under a geometric microscope.
A very unforgiving microscope.
Right. And they expose this spatial anomaly in the latent space that is so fundamental to the architecture. I mean, it really forces complete reevaluation of how dual encoder networks organize information.
And it's not just a weird training artifact, right?
No, not at all. It is an inherent property of the system's topology. It's built in.
The goal for our deep dive today is to deconstruct this phenomenon, which the authors term the modality gap. We're going to examine its mathematical origins literally at the exact moment of initialization and dissect how contrastive optimization actively preserves it.
Instead of eliminating it, which is what you'd expect.
Yeah, exactly. And then we'll unpack the implications this has for, zero-shot performance and model fairness for you as practitioners. So, okay, let's unpack this. We should probably start by establishing the baseline expectation of how a multimodal contrastive model is actually supposed to map its embedding space.
Right. So the standard premise relies on this idea of a shared latent hypersphere. You take paired inputs, say an image of a dog, and the text string, a photo of a dog.
Standard contrastive pairs?
Exactly. The image passes through your vision encoder, the text goes through the text encoder, and both of those outputs are L2 normalized. So they get projected onto the surface of this high-dimensional sphere.
And the objective function here is usually info NC.
Yeah. Typically info NC.
Yeah.
And it's designed to maximize the cosine similarity between the matched pairs in the numerator while, minimizing the similarity against all the mismatched negative samples in the batch, which sit in the denominator.
So mathematically, the intent is basically to force the dog image embedding and the dog text embedding to converge on the exact same coordinate space.
Right. If the loss converges nicely, those domains should be perfectly interwoven. You shouldn't be able to tell them apart spatially.
But the empirical reality completely contradicts that intent.
It really does. I mean, the researchers extracted embeddings from a fully trained CLIP model, and they used UFP to project them down to 2 dimensions just to analyze the topology.
And what did that look like?
The vision embeddings and text embeddings are not intermingled at all. They occupy completely separate, distinct, non-overlapping regions of the embedding space.
Like totally segregated.
Yeah, they maintain this strict, measurable distance from one another. It's literally a gap.
Which is wild, because if the loss function explicitly penalizes distance between matched pairs, a stark separation like that implies the optimizer is finding a local minimum that just defies the core objective entirely.
Exactly. It's settling into a state that looks like a failure mode.
And I want to clarify for everyone, this isn't an isolated anomaly limited to, CLIP's specific data set or just the vision transformer architecture.
Oh, no. The pervasiveness of the modality gap is honestly one of the most compelling findings in the whole paper. The authors replicated this analysis across vastly different domains.
Like what else?
Well, they evaluated video CLIP, which maps natural video to text. They analyzed convert, which maps medical x-rays to clinical text reports.
Wow, even medical imaging.
Yeah. And they even tested KLASP, which maps amino acid sequences to textual descriptions.
So it's everywhere.
It really is. Regardless of the architecture, the modality, or the dimensionality, whether you project into a 512 dimensional space or a 768 dimensional space, the modality gap remains glaringly present. The modalities simply refuse to mix.
That sets up a huge apparent paradox. If the gradient updates are continuously trying to pull these matched pairs together, how can they permanently settle in completely different neighborhoods of the hypersphere?
It's a great question.
I mean, we typically blame anisotropic embedding spaces on the data distribution. Like, if you've trained language models, you've seen representation degeneration in BERT or GPT.
Right, the cone effect.
Exactly. The embedding space collapses into a narrow cone, but the literature standard is to usually attribute that to the Zipfian distribution of natural language word frequencies.
And that's exactly what the authors initially thought, too. But they hypothesized that the data distribution might actually be a red herring here.
So how did they test that?
To test it, they looked away from the training data entirely. They examined the network at epoch 0, literally before a single gradient step was taken.
Wait, epoch 0.
Yes, and they discovered that the modality gap is already present at random initialization.
That is crazy. That implies the architecture itself is forcing this separation before it even sees a single token or pixel of data.
It is a general inductive bias of deep neural architectures. They demonstrated that you get this narrow cone effect even with randomly initialized weights.
Even without real data.
Yeah, even when feeding the network pure random noise, like standard normal Gaussian distributions or uniformly random integers, the output embeddings inevitably cluster into a tightly restricted region of the hypersphere.
Let's ground the math on how that actually happens, because I know the paper provides a really rigorous mathematical proof for this in Theorem 1.
They do. They characterize how linear layers paired with nonlinearities act as contraction mappings.
Right, so think about the geometry of a real U activation, for example. You are systematically chopping off all the negative coordinates.
Exactly. Every single time data passes through that layer, you are effectively folding the space and shoving all your vectors into a single non-negative orthant.
And that geometric restriction compounds with depth, doesn't it?
It compounds massively.
Yeah.
Under mild assumptions, the authors proved that with high probability, each layer of the neural network shrinks the angle between any pair of embedding vectors. The nonlinearity strictly limits the accessible volume of the space.
Did they quantify how severe that shrinkage is?
Yeah, they set up a simple two-layer multi-layer perceptron with a sigmoid activation. They fed it random inputs, and the average cosine similarity between the outputs was pushed to 0.99.
Wow. A cosine similarity of 0.99 in a high-dimensional space is practically a singularity.
It really is.
Because for listeners who are accustomed to thinking in 3 dimensions, high-dimensional spaces are notoriously unintuitive when it comes to surface area. The paper notes that in a 3D sphere, a cosine similarity of 0.56 occupies roughly 3.34% of the surface area.
Right, which seems somewhat intuitive.
But if you move to a 512-dimensional hypersphere, that exact same cosine similarity occupies a fraction of the surface area that is less than 1 over 2 to the 512th power.
It's an unfathomably small number.
Right. The volume scales exponentially, so clustering at 0.99 means the network is projecting everything into a practically microscopic sliver of the available latent space.
It's an incredibly concentrated region. The network isn't utilizing the full hypersphere at all. It's utilizing a minuscule fraction of a percent of it.
So if we synthesize this for a second, think of a randomly initialized encoder not as like a floodlight illuminating the whole hypersphere, but as a highly focused laser pointer.
It's a perfect analogy.
And because a multimodal model utilizes 2 completely separate encoders, a vision encoder and a text encoder, with 2 different random initializations, you basically have 2 independent laser pointers aiming at completely different random coordinates on the surface of the sphere.
Exactly. The initial state of the network guarantees 2 distinctively different cones. Your image embeddings are densely packed in one tiny cone, and your text embeddings are densely packed in a completely different distant cone.
And this geometric initialization is essentially the birth of the modality gap.
Yes, that is where it starts.
Okay, so the independent initializations explain why the gap exists at epoch 0. But the optimizer's entire job is to pull those points together. If stochastic gradient descent is failing to close that initial gap, it implies the loss landscape itself must be actively hostile to the merging.
It is incredibly hostile.
Did the authors map out that landscape to see what SGD is actually dealing with?
They did. They used an approach they called the embedding shift experiment. Basically, they wanted to see how the loss behaves if you do the optimizer's job for it.
Okay, how did they do that?
They took 5,000 image caption pairs from the MSCOZO dataset and ran them through a pre-trained CLIP model. Then, they calculated a single vector that represents the modality gap.
So they calculate the center of gravity for all the image embeddings, calculate the center of gravity for all the text embeddings, and just draw a straight line between those 2 means to get a single translation vector.
Precisely. They defined a scalar value they called delta gap. And because CLIP's embeddings are L2 normalized, they were able to manually translate the text and image embeddings toward each other along the surface of the hypersphere.
Artificially closing the distance.
Right. They artificially closed the distance between the two domains by adjusting that delta gap value. They systematically pushed the modalities together and recorded the resulting contrastive loss at each step.
The assumption being that as the domains perfectly align, the loss should smoothly drop to its absolute minimum, right?
You would think so, but the reality is exactly the opposite.
What happened?
When they shifted the embeddings to close the gap, the contrastive loss increased sharply.
Wait, it went up?
It spiked. The loss landscape features a severe, inherent repulsive structure. For CLIP, they found that the global minimum of the loss function actually occurs when the image and text embeddings are separated by a specific Euclidean distance of 0.82.
So the optimizer actively punishes you for bringing the modalities closer than 0.82.
Exactly. It pushes back.
That is deeply counterintuitive, and they even mapped out the extreme edges of this landscape too, right?
Yeah, they pushed it as far as it could go.
Like if you push the embeddings in the opposite direction, essentially putting the vision and text clusters back to back at antipodal points on the sphere, which would be a Euclidean distance of 2.0, there is actually a local minimum there.
It's true. The loss landscape is actively resisting domain alignment at every turn.
It is literally an invisible force field maintaining that 0.82 L2 distance.
That's exactly what a function's like.
But if the loss landscape is pushing them apart, it mathematically has to be coming from the denominator of the contrastive loss function, because the numerator is just the dot product of the positive pairs. It strictly wants them to overlap.
Right, the numerator pulls them together.
So the denominator is where the penalty for overlapping with negative samples lives. Is the model just hypersensitive to those negative samples?
It is entirely about the denominator, and it fundamentally comes down to the temperature parameter, tau.
Ah, the temperature.
Yeah, if you fine-tuned CLIP or similar models, you know that the temperature parameter adjusts the logits before they pass into the softmax function.
All right.
Well, CLIP actually learns its temperature parameter during training, and it consistently converges to a very low value. Specifically, tau equals 0.01.
Okay, and that tiny temperature makes the softmax distribution incredibly sharp.
Incredibly sharp.
If tau is 0.01, you are taking the dot product of the embeddings and multiplying it by 100 before exponentiating it. So a tiny mathematical overlap in the embedding space translates into a massive spike in the activation.
Exactly. It creates extreme hypersensitivity to hard negative samples.
And when you train on massive web-scraped data sets, mismatched data is inevitable.
Oh, yeah. You have noisy captions, ambiguous images, or text that partially describes multiple images in the batch.
Right.
So the network learns that if an image embedding accidentally drifts too close to the wrong text embedding, that low temperature scales that minor overlap into a massive penalty in the denominator of the loss function.
So the optimizer essentially realizes that perfectly aligning the positive pairs is just a high-risk strategy.
It's too dangerous for the loss.
The safest way to minimize the loss and avoid those catastrophic penalties from hard negatives isn't to perfectly overlap the dog image with the dog text. The safest strategy is to just keep the entire domain of images physically buffered away from the entire domain of text.
That is exactly what happens. The network discovers that maintaining this uniform gap of 0.82 is the optimal mathematical trade-off.
It's a compromise.
Yeah, it allows the matched pairs to be closer to each other than to the mismatched pairs, which satisfies the contrastive objective, but it keeps the domain separated enough that the sharp softmax doesn't trigger those massive penalties from noisy negative samples.
So the interaction of the low temperature parameter, the presence of hard negatives in the training data, and the initial random segregation of the cones. Well, it all locks this geometry in place permanently.
It locks it in. And to prove this mechanism, the researchers manipulated the temperature dynamically.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they ran simulations and fine-tuned models where they forced the temperature to a higher value, like tau equals 1.
Just softening the softmax.
Exactly. By softening the softmax function, the gradients stop overreacting to the hard negatives, and the repulsive structure in the landscape completely melted away.
Wow.
The optimization was finally able to close the modality gap. The domains merged.
That is brilliant. It demonstrates that the gap is a deliberate, mathematically enforced survival strategy by the optimizer. It's heavily dependent on how the contrastive loss function is parameterized.
Exactly.
Okay, so now that we understand the mechanics, that it originates from the inductive bias of neural layers and is preserved by the temperature-scaled contrastive loss, How do practitioners actually utilize this?
That's the real question.
Because if you are deploying CLIP in a zero-shot classification pipeline, your first instinct as a machine learning engineer might be to build a custom regularization term to squash this gap down to zero.
And the researchers strongly caution against zeroing it out indiscriminately.
Really? Why?
They demonstrated that this geometric translation in the embedding space is essentially a hidden, tunable hyperparameter available at inference time.
Wait, at inference time, you don't need to retrain the model.
Don't need to retrain it at all. By artificially shifting the embeddings along the gap vector post-training, you can profoundly impact downstream performance.
So they evaluated this on several zero-shot image classification tasks.
Yes. They applied this post-hoc gap modification to datasets like CFAR10, CFAR100, and Eurosat.
And what were the results?
What they found was that modifying the distance improved zero-shot accuracy, but the optimal direction of the shift varied depending on the dataset. For CFAR10, artificially increasing the gap slightly yielded the best performance. But for CFAR100 and Eurosat, compressing the gap and bringing the modalities closer together was actually optimal.
That suggests the modality gap acts as almost a buffer that captures different levels of semantic granularity.
That's a good way to look at it.
But where this spatial tuning becomes exceptionally critical is when we look at model fairness and bias.
Yes, this part is crucial.
The researchers ran an extensive evaluation using the Fairface dataset. For those unfamiliar, Fairface contains images across 14 different demographic classes. To test for denigration harms, the authors paired these images with text prompts for crime-related classes like thief or criminal and non-human classes like gorilla or chimpanzee.
It's a very rigorous statistical test.
Right. It's designed to see if the model's latent space has absorbed toxic biased associations from its pre-training data.
And the sensitivity of these biases to the modality gap was just staggering. In their baseline test, the gap distance was at its natural 0.82. The researchers then artificially expanded the gap, increasing the distance from 0.82 to 0.97.
So just pushing them further apart.
Right, just a simple geometric translation, universally pushing the entire image domain further away from the text domain. Doing this consistently reduced denigration harms across all demographic races in the dataset.
I think we need to explain the mechanics of why expanding the gap actually reduces bias.
Go for it.
By pushing the embeddings apart, you are uniformly increasing the Euclidean distance between all images and all text classes. Biased associations, like linking a demographic image to a crime-related text prompt, often rely on precarious, marginal overlaps in the softmax distribution.
They're weak links.
Exactly. They are weak semantic links born from noisy pre-training data, so when you physically pull the domains apart, you are creating a global buffer.
Right.
It effectively breaks the weakest, noisiest semantic links first, which tend to be the biased ones, while the strong, true positive links, like matching a dog image to the word dog, have enough cosine similarity to survive the expanded distance.
That is exactly the dynamic. That global buffer acts as an immediate filter for toxic associations. And the cost to the model's utility was practically non-existent.
Really? No accuracy drop.
Almost none. When they expanded the gap to 0.97 to reduce those denigration harms, the top one accuracy of the model dropped by a negligible 0.00008.
Wow, so it was basically a compute-free improvement to ethical alignment.
Yes. But because it relies on breaking semantic links, tuning it in the wrong direction has severe consequences.
What happens if you tune it wrong?
It's extremely severe. When they shrank the gap too much, pushing the distance down to 0.07.
So forcing the domains to heavily overlap.
Right. It drastically exacerbated crime-related biases across the board. You are compressing the space so much that those marginal noisy overlaps turn into hard semantic links.
That's dangerous.
It is. And conversely, when they pushed the gap too far in the opposite direction, expanding it to 1.29, the global buffer became way too large.
What did that do?
It caused a massive spike in non-human biases and a severe drop in overall accuracy because you begin breaking the true positive semantic links as well.
So a simple geometric translation in the shared embedding space serves as a literal tuning dial.
A very sensitive dial.
You are dialing a Euclidean distance, but the output you are modulating is the model's core accuracy and its ethical alignment. It highlights just how deeply semantic meaning and statistical bias are entangled with the pure spatial geometry of the latent hypersphere.
It emphasizes that simply understanding the topology of the space we are creating, without expending any additional compute on retraining or fine-tuning, can yield immediate operational improvements at deployment.
Powerful stuff. Well, we have mapped out a complex geometric phenomenon today. To synthesize the critical takeaways for you, the modality gap is a fundamental feature of multimodal networks.
Yep.
It is born from the inductive bias of neural networks, specifically the cone effect caused by contraction mappings in nonlinear layers like ReLU. It is locked into place initially because dual encoder architectures rely on two separate random initializations, creating two distinct cones in the latent space. And finally, it is permanently preserved during optimization by the repulsive loss landscape.
The force field.
Exactly. Which is generated by a low-temperature contrastive loss function trying to mathematically survive the presence of hard negative samples in the training data.
That perfectly encapsulates the architecture of the modality gap. But the paper's future work section actually raises a structural question that challenges everything we just established.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we know this gap is inherent to dual encoder architectures because they start with two independent parameter spaces.
Right. Two independent initializations resulting in two independent cones.
Exactly. So what happens to the underlying geometry if we eliminate that premise entirely?
How do you mean?
Well, what if we use a single, unified, encoder-like omnivore to fuse different data modalities from the very first layer? If there is only one initialization and one shared parameter space for both images and text, does the modality gap vanish entirely from the final embedding space?
Oh, wow.
Right. Or does the network, still driven by that low-temperature contrastive loss, simply find a new hidden way to internally segregate the data inside its own hidden layers before it ever reaches the final projection?
Does the architecture dictate the gap, or will the loss function eventually force the architecture to build one? That is a fascinating spatial problem to consider as unified multimodal models become the standard.
It's definitely the next frontier to watch.
Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the fundamental assumptions of your architectures and keep exploring the geometric foundations of your models.